Spiritual ego. If you consider yourself to be spiritual, which that term alone is kind of funny because everything we do is spiritual, and even if you're religious, you're spiritual. However, if you consider yourself to be a spiritual person, you may have become aware that there's a set of rules that have been placed in a box for what it takes to be the most spiritual you can be. Some of the things in this box are spiritual people shouldn't eat meat. If you're a vegetarian or a vegan, you're more spiritual than the person who's eating meat. And if you're spiritual, you shouldn't drink alcohol. And if you don't drink alcohol, you're more spiritual than the person pounding back a beer or drinking some wine. There's also a lot to be said about having sexual encounters with individuals. And for me personally, I've fallen into this box for a very long time. And just this morning, after chatting with a friend, I've been extremely humbled. Back in 2020, I found myself surrounded by shamans that were consuming meat and drinking alcohol. And at the time, I was a vegetarian and sober. And I would look at these individuals and I would judge them. I'd be like, oh, you're not as far along on your path as I am. I have more willpower than you. But the truth is, judging other people for the path that they've chosen is very unspiritual. And for me personally, there's a part of me that's been wanting to go back to eating meat for quite some time, but I kept telling myself, that's not very spiritual. However, I realized that negating an aspect of myself is actually not very spiritual. And despite having quit drinking alcohol for 7.5 years and then going back to having a few glasses of wine for a couple of years, I quit consuming any alcohol back in December of 2024. And a part of me is like, oh, I'd like to have a glass of wine here and there. But then there's this aspect of me that's like, well, that's not very spiritual. We came down here to have a human experience, and being your most authentic self is truly what it means to be spiritual. It also pertains to the music we listen to. After my awakening, I was like, oh, I shouldn't be listening to gangster rap and heavy metal music. And, growing up in my 20s, that was a big part of my life. And, even though I liked bands like Pantera and Ministry, more recently, I was like, oh, I can't listen to those because it's not very spiritual. And, in the last few days, I started downloading some of that kind of music and throwing on the heavy metal. And I feel like I've incorporated an aspect of me from my teenage years that I've been shunning all this time because it wasn't very spiritual. Just this morning, I became aware of just how much spiritual ego I was still harnessing and how I was doing things or not doing things out of fear. So when it comes to judging others on their path, that is the true definition of spiritual ego. Ask yourself where you're not being authentic because of the quote-unquote spiritual box that you've placed yourself in. I've been vegetarian for roughly 8 months, and there's a plate of chicken wings that's calling my name. However, there is an aspect of myself that feels bad that an animal has to die in order for me to eat it. And I'm also aware of the fact that when an animal dies, that energy is contained within that meat and then you're consuming it. So for me personally, I won't be consuming any meat until I give thanks to that animal for giving its life so I could consume it, as well as I'll be transmuting any negative energy. And also for anyone out there that's gone on a long stint without drinking, if alcohol was a problem for you, then maybe going back to having a drink is not for you. And if you've cultivated a life where you're happy without alcohol, then you should continue down that path. However, for me, yesterday was Friday night. I'm just like, man, I'd love to have a glass of wine and some chicken wings. And that is the path that I feel that is calling my name. And so despite this spiritual box of rules, that's the path I'm going to continue down. Will I ever go back to not drinking at all and being a vegetarian? Perhaps. But right now, this is expressing my most authentic self. And many people out there in the spiritual community are still running around with spiritual ego, judging others. I know I've done it for much of my journey. Just wanted to thank everyone that's gone out and purchased a copy of my biography called Finding Me. All the people that are ordering custom crystal jewelry from my new jewelry line, as well as the people that are purchasing a healing session where I connect with your soul and guide you to the 12th dimension and let Jesus perform all the healings. That's all I got. Hit that like and subscribe. We'll see you in the next one.